never negotiate out of fear, but let us never fear to negotiate.
There can be no whitewash at the White House.
In 1912, Woodrow Wilson won a massive landslide victory with just 42% of the popular vote. In fact, he won 435 of the 531 Electoral College votes, mainly because of a split in the Republican Party between President William Taft and Theodore Roosevelt. Wilson had been president of Princeton University and governor of New Jersey before becoming president. As president, he changed the nation's economic policies and led the United States into the First World War in 1917. He was the leading architect of the League of Nations and developed new concepts in foreign policy, which later became known as Wilsonianism. He was a man of big global ideas and political theories. However, his involvement of the United States in the war and his subsequent failure to join the League of Nations remained somewhat controversial. The United States lost over 116,000 men in the war and were the main cause of the German defeat. However, Wilson's failure to bring the United States into the League of Nations and enforce the peace meant that the American war effort was largely ineffective. Wilson also had a huge impact on domestic affairs. His first term was mainly concerned with passing his progressive program known as the New Freedom. His first major priority was the Revenue Act, or Underwood Act of 1913. This act radically changed the financial system. It moved tax collection from tariffs to income tax. Indeed, many Democrats have believed for years that since tariff raised the prices for everyone, it hit poorer people harder. By moving towards an income-based tax, the government was enabled to tax the rich at a higher level, and thereafter, income tax became a major source of government revenue. Following the financial panic of 1907, leading senators such as Nelson Aldrich studied the British and the European banking systems. They soon realised that the United States needed a central banking system to control financial panics. Aldrich favoured a system largely controlled by private interests, but Democrats such as William Jennings Bryan argued for a government-controlled system. Eventually, Wilson crafted a plan acceptable to both sides. The Federal Reserve Act of 1913 set up 12 regional banks throughout the country, and this was controlled by a central board filled with presidential appointees known as the Federal Reserve. Wilson also brought his progressive ideas to business and banking. In 1914, he pushed Congress to pass the Clayton Antitrust Act. This act forced big business corporations and banks to provide their services at lower and more competitive prices. It reduced price fixing and other non-competitive practices. The Federal Trade Commission Act set up the Federal Trade Commission to monitor big business on an ongoing basis and to ensure that they operated within the law. There was also a number of important constitutional amendments passed. The 17th Amendment, passed during the Taft presidency, had senators elected by popular vote for the first time during Wilson's presidency. The 18th Amendment, which prohibited the sale and transport of alcohol, passed through Congress in 1917 and was ratified by 2/3 of the states over the next 2 years. The 19th Amendment, granting women the right to vote, was ratified by the states in 1920. Great progress was made in regard to business, the financial system, and democracy in general. However, Wilson was less successful in regard to labour relations and civil rights. In April 1914, the Ludlow massacre occurred. Here, in a single day, 20 people were killed in violent clashes with the National Guard in the Colorado coal miners' strike. Wilson also demanded the segregation of white and coloured workers in government offices. These actions were later seen as aggressive or even racist. However, on a more positive note, he pushed Congress to enact an 8-hour day for railway workers, a move that was later followed in other industries. In regard to foreign policy, Wilson supported the democratic policy of opposition to United States ownership of colonies. He worked towards the independence of the Philippines. The Jones Act of 1916 committed the United States to the eventual independence of the islands, which was eventually achieved 30 years later. He also pursued an active military policy in regard to many Latin American countries, despite having criticised former presidents for such policies. He sent troops to Haiti, to Cuba, to Panama, and in 1914 the Bryan-Chamorro Treaty was signed with Nicaragua, which gave the United States exclusive rights to building a canal there. Wilson had previously talked in very idealistic terms, but as president found it extremely difficult to resist demands from big business corporations to have their business interests protected in Latin America. Mexico was also a troubled country at this time. There were several military coups and counter-revolutions. Francisco Madero became president in 1911 but was assassinated in a military coup by Victoria Huerta in February 1913. Wilson rejected the new Mexican government and sent a number of battleships to the port of Veracruz. However, Mexicans of all shades rejected US intervention into their country. The First World War broke out in Europe in July 1914. Germany and Austria-Hungary were pitted against Britain, France and Russia and several smaller countries. Wilson's main objective was to keep America out of the war. However, as a neutral country, the United States also demanded the right to trade with both sides. In May 1915, a German submarine sank the British ocean liner the Lusitania, killing 1,200 people on board, 128 of whom were Americans. Wilson responded by warning the Germans against similar actions in the future. Secretary of State William Jennings Bryan resigned in protest as he believed the president's response was too aggressive. Throughout 1916, Wilson and Congress responded to the growing preparation for war movement by expanding both the Army and the Navy. He was re-elected in November of that year, mainly on a platform of neutrality and progressive reforms. He defeated Charles Evans Hughes by 9.1 to 8.5 million votes. Alan Louis Benson also ran as an anti-war socialist in that election. He believed war should be declared by referendum of the people only, and that recruits should be drawn only from people who had approved of the war. In January 1917, the Germans began a more aggressive strategy of unrestricted submarine warfare. The Germans knew the more aggressive strategy could bring America into the war, but hoped to defeat the Allied powers before America became fully mobilized. However, the Zimmermann telegram released in early March 1917 inflamed public opinion further and created the momentum towards war. The German Foreign Minister Arthur Zimmermann proposed a military alliance between Germany and Mexico if the United States entered the war against Germany. In return, Germany would help Mexico recover her lost territories of Texas, Arizona and New Mexico. On the 2nd of April 1917, Wilson addressed Congress and declared war against Germany. Both houses of Congress strongly applauded the president. The following month, Congress passed the Conscription Act, which drafted 500,000 men into the Army and Navy. By the end of the war, 4.5 million men had been drafted. The Navy expanded mainly to protect US ships in what became known as the convoy system. By the middle of 1917, thousands of American expeditionary forces were arriving in France. They fought bravely, but separately from the European forces throughout 1917, winning many important battles. By March 1918, Russia left the war by signing the Brest-Litovsk Treaty with Germany. This allowed the Germans to concentrate all their forces on the Western Front. However, by July 1918, 10,000 American troops were arriving in Europe on a daily basis. Over 112,000 Americans lost their lives in the conflict. 10,000 American soldiers were never actually identified. One of these is buried in the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier in Arlington National Cemetery in Virginia. They played a crucial role in the defeat of Germany, especially in the summer of 1918. By November 1918, Germany knew they couldn't win the war, so they sued for peace on the basis of Wilson's 14-point programme, which he had delivered to Congress earlier. The programme contained such ideas as peace without victory and a League of Nations that would enforce the peace. Following the war, peace talks began in Paris at Versailles in January 1919. Wilson travelled to France with a small delegation which included Secretary of State Robert Lansing and a number of top legal and military advisers. The Republican Party, which had won the midterm elections in November 1918, were there, but no senior Republicans were on the delegation. The Big Four, Britain, United States, France and Italy, were the main players at the Versailles peace talks. Wilson and the French Prime Minister did not agree on a range of issues, particularly in relation to Germany. None of the major European powers were greatly impressed with Wilson's idea of peace without victory, and his concept of self-determination for all nations proved to be far more difficult to work out in practice than he anticipated. Eastern Europe is an immensely complex place. However, Wilson did manage to curtail the worst elements of French thinking in regard to how to deal with Germany. However, when he returned to the US in the summer of 1919, he faced strong opposition from Republicans who feared that the League could draw America into another major war. There was particular strong opposition to Article 10, which committed all members of the League to the defence of any one of them that would be attacked. This article struck at the heart of American independence. It was rejected by a majority of the Senate. Several amendments were proposed, but these were all rejected by Wilson on the basis that it would inevitably unravel the entire agreement. He was probably right in that regard. Instead, he travelled the country to drum up support over the heads of Congress, but he was largely misreading the public mood at this stage. Most people believed America had sacrificed enough in European entanglements and wished to return to a form of isolation. By September 1919, the president suffered a major stroke while campaigning in support of the League. He spent the last 18 months of his presidency half paralysed, in bad moods, severe mood swings, very poor vision and hardly able to walk. Access to him was controlled by his wife Edith. In December 1920, he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts at global peace. But in his final year as president, the mood of the country had changed. Warren Harding, representing a return to normalcy, won the presidency in November 1920. Wilson was deeply disappointed at his failure to persuade Congress and the public to bring the United States into the League of Nations. Perhaps he sensed the danger of having defeated and humiliated the greatest power in Europe without a structure in place to control them. However, the United Nations, which came into being following the Second World War, gave shape to many of his ideas. Thereafter, the United States would play a central role in international affairs. Woodrow Wilson died on February 3, 1924, at the age of 67. He is buried at the National Cathedral Cemetery in Washington, D.C.